appreciate you coming on to this International Institute of Communications event about the consumer data right. My name is Michael Kernan and I'm one of the Vice Presidents of the Australian chapter of the IIC. Joining us here as well is Derek Wilding and Joe Ryan from the IIC. Before I begin, I'd like to acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, on whose land we meet here in Sydney tonight, and pay my respects to their elders past and present. In Melbourne, you're meeting on the land of the Wurrung and Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. I'd also like to acknowledge their elders. I'd like to take this opportunity to thank you, Angela, and Holding Redlich for generously hosting us tonight in both cities, and Angela in particular for agreeing to host the panel. Big thank you too to Clifford Chance, who in London hosted a Q&A which was recorded specifically for this event with Dr. Bill Roberts, head of the Open Banking section at the UK Competition and Markets Authority. And we've got a short video of that chat to share during the presentation tonight. So we're really pleased to bring that international perspective to this Australian debate because that's what the IIC is all about. And in particular in the Australian chapter, we want to connect the debate on policy issues here with debates that are going on or preceded us slightly in other jurisdictions, as has been the case with open banking in the UK. The IIC itself is about to turn 50. It's a global body, independent global body based in London. It convenes workshops, events and forums around the world, and they're regularly held in Washington, Miami and Brussels, and in February in Asia Pacific as well. So in February, for example, there's a telecommunications and media forum being hosted in KL. The major IIC annual conference is held in October and it moves location each year. It was in Mexico City this year and Joe and Derek can tell you all about that. I've been to a couple of events, one in Washington and one in Singapore of the IICs. And I think the real value is that they bring the international regulatory community, who sometimes meet a couple of days in advance, but then industry and academia and policymakers as well. It's a Chatham House rules environment, so I've found it's a very frank forum. We had a two-day forum here in July, which this seminar follows on because that was the London-based IIC coming to Australia. We had, among others, Peter Harris giving a Productivity Commission perspective on the consumer data right. So in my day job, I'm the head of regulatory affairs at SBS, so we're not going to be a regulated industry for now, but when I hear of big tranches of consumer data moving around the place, I think about mandatory data breach scheme, which I know is also something that the IIC colleagues here tonight would be thinking about. But from briefly reading the IIC's discussion paper, I know that security and privacy are key pillars of this scheme. So I look forward to hearing about that and other policy issues as we have the discussion, and I'll hand over to Angela now. Thank you.
Thanks, Michael. So my job tonight is to really host our speakers. So I wanted to start by giving a brief introduction of each of them. So our first speaker on the far right is Bruce Cooper, who's the General Manager, Consumer Data Right branch of the IIC. Bruce joined the IIC in 1998, having spent his early career in a number of private and government legal roles. So at the IIC, Bruce has worked in different areas, including managing the IIC's corporate and regulatory law unit and its advocacy and international engagement activities. So in his current role, he has the enormous job of managing the Consumer Data Right branch. Our second speaker, as Michael mentioned, is actually a pre-recorded interview with Dr. Bill Roberts. So Dr. Roberts has a long history with the open banking regime in the UK, which is the UK version of the Consumer Data Right. Our third speaker will then be Pip Freebairn from the ABA. So the banking sector will be the first cab off the rank with the consumer data right in Australia. So a lot of the consultation to date has been with the ABA and its constituent members. And Pip is here to talk about their interests and concerns. Our final speaker tonight, last but not least, will look at the consumer data right from the telco perspective. Luke van Hooft from Optus. Luke is the Director of Economic Regulation at Optus, and prior to that worked in a number of consulting firms as well as at Vodafone, where he held an economic policy roles. Luke also spent time at the Australia's Productivity Commission before that. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Bruce.
Thanks very much, Angela. I'm not used to speaking with a microphone like this, but if it's too soft or loud, just wave. I have to confess I saw Bohemian Rhapsody on the when I was first given the microphone. I thought I did go back to that, but I don't have one tiny bit of his showmanship, so apologies for that. So I've been asked to speak for about 15 or 20 minutes to give you a bit of an introduction on the consumer data right. So I thought what I would do to start with is just set out a little bit of the policy background and then move through the regulatory framework that is being put in place and some of the core obligations that will exist for actors in the consumer data right environment. And then look at a couple of issues that I thought might be of interest to players who might be involved in the telco sector, and then just wind up with some concluding remarks. So just starting with the sort of policy background, the Productivity Commission, I think, was probably one of the last reports that recommended a comprehensive consumer data access right. There've been a long string of them, but I think that was the most significant. And it had two main recommendations. One is that it would give consumers the ability to choose to share their data with people they wish to, and the other was around open data, making predominantly government databases open to policymakers and others. And slightly confusingly, I think open banking is referred to as the consumer data access in the banking sector. It's not open data. I think that they sometimes get confused. It really is consumer data right. Really is about the sharing of data or data portability for the telco sector. You understand portability. And just in relation to banking, it's partly around giving consumers some of the value from the data that relates to them that really is held at the moment by the banks. I mean, the banks treat consumer data as an asset, and it's really giving some of the value back to the consumers by allowing them to send it to service providers who can use it in the consumer's interest, at the consumer's choice. One of the quote, I might just read you a brief quote that came from the Farrell report into how open banking would work, which followed the Productivity Commission and the government's decision to start with a consumer data right in the banking sector. So Scott Farrell said open banking is designed to give customers more control over their information, leading to more choice in their banking and more convenience in managing their money, and resulting in more confidence in the use and value of an asset mostly undiscovered by customers, their data. So I think that's probably a fair summary of what the policy driver for implementing a comprehensive consumer data right is. And internationally, open banking has commenced in the UK, and a number of other jurisdictions are looking at it, but Australia is fairly unique in that it's looking at an economy-wide data regime. Although we're starting with banking, the government's announced that telco and energy will follow in the other order. And so just perhaps a little bit on timing in the banking sector. It will be phased. So for the large 4 banks, the government has put a target date of 1 July for the first lot of consumer accounts to be brought within the system, and that's sort of transaction accounts, credit cards, debit cards, some of the more simple everyday accounts, with mortgage accounts to follow on the 1st of February 2020, and then other accounts on the 1st of July 2020. So there's sort of over 12 months, the big four banks will be brought within the system in their various accounts. With smaller deposit-taking institutions being phased in relation to each of those things 12 months after the big banks. But there's quite an interest from the smaller banks in to opt into the system early. And I think they see that it's an opportunity to offer to their customers the ability to share information, so their customers can sort of get services from other service providers. So that's something that the IIC is thinking closely about, whether we can do that, whether we've got the time to sort of have in place systems and how that will work. The energy sector, which I've mentioned, I should just mention then that some energy and telco sectors will come in not necessarily after all of that is completed. There's quite a lot of pressure from the energy sector to be brought within the consumer data right sooner rather than later. And whether or not they can wait till the big four banks even have finished being sort of transitioned in 1 July 2020, I think is an open question at the moment. And there's been quite a lot of work done already in the energy sphere. People may have heard of the Houston Kemp report, which looked at how consumer data basically it was a little bit broader than that. It looked at access to data in the energy space, and it did end up recommending that the consumer data right was a good way to draw within to inquire into what other sectors could usefully be brought within the CDR. And it's far too early. I have personal views about what other sectors might be of interest. Superannuation, insurance, probably supermarket data would be coupled there, just purely personal views. And so the timeline for 1 July is really tight. We're hearing that from not only from the big banks, but smaller banks. We heard it in a number of the submissions that we had from the telco sector and the energy sector in response to our rules framework. So the data standards body or the chair of the data standards body says he's suitably uncomfortable. And I think that's probably a reasonable position for the IIC as well. It is tight. We've said that we would publish draft rules by the end of this year. We think we'll have the decision points down by then, so we will have gone through the rules framework and all the issues that we had mapped out in the rules framework. We'll be able to say this is where we're going to land on these things, or if not all, then most. But the reality, I think, is that we won't have sufficient time to prepare a draft legislative instrument with the sort of, the polish that needs to be with that. So we've suggested to participants in the banking sector that what we'll aim to do is get out a decision document, whatever we call that, in time for Christmas, and help them sort of continue the planning and implementation phase. And we've said that we will sort of keep that under review, whether implementation on for 1 July may sort of jeopardise the how it is introduced, and if there is any sense that to aim for a deadline is going to jeopardise security of the system. then we've said we'll advise government about that and look to adjust the starting date. Let me look just very briefly at the regulatory framework. It's reasonably complicated. Treasury are in the process of drafting legislation that will sit in the Competition Consumer Act and make it even more of a convoluted alphabet soup than it currently is. And they're also looking at designation instruments for each of the sector that will set out who are designated as data holders and what data is included. It's intended that legislation be introduced early in December, and from what I understand, that looks like it's still on track. I've talked a little bit about our rules and where they are. The Data 61 is the data standards body at the moment in the process of developing standards that will sit underneath our rules and map out exactly what sort of data formats and things like that and API technical details. And that work is progressing publicly on GitHub if anyone wants to follow that. We've had some comments recently from non-techie type people that it's really hard to follow and understand. And I guess that's a challenge that we probably need to look at, whether we need to do something about that. And obviously we can't make the rules till the legislation is made, and Data 61 can't make their standards until our rules are in place. And while it might be nice to do them sequentially, we're doing them all in parallel and trying to make sure that we're working together so they're going to develop consistently. But if there is a hold up in the passage of the legislation, there's an election or something early next year, then that will affect timelines and it will affect our ability to make rules and Data 61's ability to make standards. So now I just thought I'd talk a little bit about how the system might look in practice. And if people have seen our rules framework document, there was a diagram in that. I probably want to wave my hands at this stage, but I shouldn't, otherwise I'll lose the microphone. How we envisage it might work is that a consumer would be online with a proposed service provider, and the service provider might be a comparison website, or it might be a budgeting app, or energy. It might be someone advising on what would be the right size, solar panels or battery or what have you. And the data recipient of that service provider would suggest, well, I can, to facilitate that service, it'd be great if you could share your banking data, your energy data with me. And at that point in time, the data recipient would contact the bank and say, I've got consent from one of your consumers to one of your customers to share their data. And at that point, the bank would need to check with their customer whether they did have consent and exactly what the terms of that consent were, what information they were consenting to share, for how long, and what is it a one-off share? Is it are they consenting to sharing it daily or what have you? So that will all need to be checked. And in the banking sector, that works quite nicely on banking app. You can verify that. You can be presented with a screen. You can confirm that with your thumbprint or your face recognition or whatever you're using. And then once they receive that, the confirmation of that consent, then the bank will be in a position to actually start sharing data with the data recipient. So that's the sort of stream. And obviously in the energy sector, and I think in the telco sector, the way that authentication happens with the data holder probably needs to be given sort of specific thought. I mean, the way that it works in the banking sector might not apply so comfortably in the other sectors. And we're conscious of that. And I guess the rules I have in mind, and they're not drafted, but I have in mind there'll be a core set of rules, and then some, separate parts or attachments or something that are industry specific, or that might modify, specific rules for that sector. Exactly how it looks, we'll have to wait and see, but that's how I kind of conceive it at the moment. So some of the things that have been quite contentious in the banking sector that I think will be different in the telco sector are around shared or joint accounts in the banking sector. I think they look probably different in the telco sector. You've got, in the telco sector, you might have one, owner of an account who has two phones, one for them, one for their partner or their children, whatever. In the banking sector, you've got a joint account, and so those sort of things are the same information, which doesn't apply, I think, for a particular phone. So that would be another thing, and I think probably minors is another thing that has been quite contentious in the banking sector, and might again be contentious, I suspect, whether you have those type of sharing of accounts in telco. So I focus, I guess, on the sharing of consumer data by a data holder. But the data holder will have two other obligations. One is to provide that information or share that information directly with the consumer, and the other is to publish product data. So that might be the terms and conditions of a bank account, what the interest rate are, what the fees are, if there are sort of interest rate holidays, what you need to do to comply with those, how long they last, that sort of thing. And those are going to be, I think, quite tricky. I had some involvement a while ago in setting out, in looking at whether or not you could design a disclosure in relation to private health insurance products that helped consumers compare accounts, and I know how difficult that was, and I think that is going to give rise to similar problems across a lot of sectors, and that's where the data standards work around setting the formats for data is particularly important. And that data, the sharing of data with a data recipient would be conducted through an API type regime. I think sharing the data directly with the consumer and publishing the product data, it wouldn't be that sort of API complex. It would be sort of more basic. All right, now I was just going to talk briefly about accreditation, and so to receive data, a service provider will need to be accredited, and accreditation will look at things like whether or not they are who they say they are, whether they're a proper person or effectively, whether they have the right insurance, whether they have the right IT and governance management within their organisation to basically take care of the consumer data. So the actual requirements are will be set out in the rules. I'm still working through those. One of the things that I think perhaps we could talk about in Q&A is tiers of accreditation. The Farrell report suggested, and this isn't something that applies in the UK, but the Farrell report suggested that there should be different levels of accreditation based on the risk of sharing data with that entity. And in the banking sector, for instance, if you are receiving all of a consumer's data, then obviously you've got the same sort of level of security that you probably need for a bank, although you're only in this situation looking at read access, not write access, so you can't put transactions through on an account. You can just see what transactions the banks will have occurred on the bank. And at a lower level of risk might be if you just see a balance, or if you just see, if you don't actually see the data, you see an insight from the data. And in those circumstances, Farrell report suggested that will encourage more data recipients and service providers and innovation if we allow those fintechs or startups to have a lower security and lower insurance and that sort of thing. The IIC sees that as a really important thing if we're going to have a vibrant ecosystem of data recipients and really encourage innovation and competition. Whether or not we can do that for the 1st of July is challenging. And I raise it here because it becomes essential, I think, when you bring other sectors into the consumer data right, and particularly say in energy, where you don't have sort of the digital recognition of a customer and the data is much less significant. I think you'd be more comfortable sharing energy data with an accredited recipient in the banking sector than you would sharing banking data with an energy data recipient. So that's the sort of instance, I think, when we'll definitely need to have that second tier of accreditation up and running. But I think we want to have it even within the sectors. Look, I was going to talk a little bit about consumer consent, but I think I've been talking for just over 15 minutes, and I might stop there. There might be questions and answers. And the other thing that I think there might be some interest in, we can also talk about in the Q&As, might be reciprocity. But I might hand back the microphone to Angela.
Thanks, Bruce. I think you raised about 5,000 issues for the Q&A type session there, including, I noticed you were brave enough to mention private health insurance, which rolling out the consumer data right in that sector is going to be a very interesting proposition, I suspect. I just wanted to introduce the video that we'll be playing with Dr. Roberts. So, as Bruce mentioned, the UK already has an open banking regime which commenced earlier this year. And so there's not a lot of track record for that open banking regime, but there is some track record. And so Dr. Roberts will talk about the role that the CMA has and some of the early trends that they're seeing in the UK in relation to that regime.
Giving just a brief overview of the open banking regime in the UK.
Okay. The regime was created to address the concerns that we found when we looked at the UK retail banking market in a 2-year inquiry which finished in 2016. And it comprises a forum for the discussion of standards because we required the major banks to adopt common standards for APIs, security and data formats. And on top of that, we placed what we call an implementation trustee. So we have a forum where the banks meet the fintechs and consumers to agree standards. And in the event that they can't reach a consensus, the implementation trustee has the casting vote. So they will have to abide by his decision if there's any disagreement on the technical standards.
It's still early days. Do you see the regime actually improving competition in the sector? If that's the case, how is it occurring?
Well, it's starting to happen, but as I said before, this will take time, and less seriously, we're not boiling a kettle, we're planting a tree. This is going to take years, but you can see the early beginnings of it in two sorts of ways. One way competition will accelerate, I think, is in enabling people to find a better bank account for their personal needs. That's particularly true with small businesses because in the UK, bank accounts for small businesses are charged on a per transaction basis, unlike the free if in credit model, which is used for most personal accounts. So if you're a small business, the amount a bank's going to charge you will vary hugely depending on how much cash you pay in each week, how many checks you pay in, whether you have any foreign currency needs, and so forth. So it's really hard to compare one bank with another. Open banking will make it very, very easy for you to do that because it will allow you to share your transaction history as a business with a potential banker. The second, more interesting way is much more dynamic, and that will, and we are starting to see this happen. That will entail the unbundling of personal current accounts. Current accounts are a bundle of services. It's a place to keep money. It's a payment system. It's a place for short-term credit if you're caught a bit short at the end of the month. Now, some of those services are very profitable. For example, unarranged overdrafts are very, very profitable for banks. So if a firm could come in and offer short-term high-interest credit as an alternative to the bank, using access to the customer's account to drive that, then that could make a big difference, because the bank's most profitable customers would suddenly be exposed to upstart competition, new digital competitors, and that's already happening in the UK. The proposition being that the provider will watch your balance. If it looks as if you're going into the red, they will pay in some money to stop you going into the red, just for long enough to keep you out of an overdraft, and they will guarantee to charge you less than your bank would have charged you for that overdraft. On the more positive side, they'll monitor, with your permission, monitor the balance you keep, and if you say, I don't want to keep any more than $2,000 in my bank account, if your balance goes above that, they'll take it out, they'll put it into an interest earning account for just as long as it needs to be there, and they will guarantee to offer you a higher rate of credit than your bank would offer you for that balance in the current account. So two very different mechanisms of action, if you want, both of which we could see happening in the market now.
In Australia, the consumer data rights are going to be rolled out first in the banking sector on similar terms to the UK's open banking regime, but then it's going to be implemented in other sectors, with telecoms and energy to be next. Are there any plans in the UK to provide for a consumer data right in sectors other than banking?
Well, we admire very much what's going on in Australia. We are aware of it, and we are in touch with the IIC about its implementation. And yes, we are actively looking at learning from the Australian model. Maybe not in terms of a broader data right, but certainly looking at the regulated sectors here, like energy, like telecoms, so forth, whether there is a read across from open banking to those sectors. The thinking so far, I think, is that where consumer behaviour drives charging, where the pattern of behaviour drives charging, and where consumers differ in their usage of a service, probably is useful. So mobile phones, for example, because people use their mobile phones in different ways and in different places too. So if you can download your usage history and present it to a variety of providers, it'll be easier to get a deal that suits your particular needs. Less clear in other sectors. In the water sector, for example, I don't think even if I had a smart water meter, I don't think it would tell the water company very much about me. So in some sectors it probably works a lot better than others, but yes, we're looking at it.
And are there any tips that you'd give Australia on implementation of the open banking regime based on the experience so far?
That's a difficult question. I think without getting too much into the detail, I think one issue to make sure of is that one is very clear about what is leaving in the competitive space and what is going to be regulated. And this is more about the detail of the implementation rather than the broad principles. Some of the problems that we've had here since the whole thing launched in January this year has been with the authentication journey. And the authentication journey for the consumer, in some cases, entails going through lots of different screens, maybe using a PIN century or card reader device, maybe even getting a call from a call center to actually make the thing happen. Some banks have more frictionless journeys than others. I think it would be good advice to make sure that from the regulator's point of view anyway, that they take a close eye on what those authentication journeys amount to and don't just leave it in the competitive space, because that's a competitive space where banks might not particularly welcome the arrival in their markets of digital competitors.
So I'm Pip Freebairn from the Australian Banking Association. I've probably got a few comments about what Bill said, but I'll leave them for later. But I'd just like to touch on three things in my remarks today. Just how the banking industry, our journey in this reform, and then secondly on two policy issues, because I have Bruce sitting here, so I need to take up the opportunity to talk again about reciprocity and value-added data. So the banking industry, the ABA, has 24 member banks, so they range from the 4 major banks to regional banks, and then also foreign banks. So there's a few of our banks who've actually already been through this. HSBC and Citibank have done this in the UK. And then we have some small neutral banks who are also involved in this work. Our first, the first exposure to this actually came out of the Murray inquiry into financial services. The FSI, the Financial System Inquiry in 2015, reported that that the PC should look at data and how banking data could be used to empower customers to make better choices. So it feels like we've sort of just suddenly had this reform come along, but it's actually been sort of brewing away. And I think there's, as Bruce said, there's been different industries, it's come from different angles, but essentially that all led the PC to look at the data availability and use inquiry which they did, which as we worked through that inquiry, the ABA's position evolved. We were initially, let's say, not entirely welcoming of open data, but of data sharing. But through time, once the banks sort of understood it better, they realised this is an excellent way to compete, empower customers, and lead to innovation in the industry. So we've embraced open data and now heavily involved in it. We've found we support the open banking, consumer data right design that Peter Harris and the PC came up with. We think it's the best design we've seen internationally. It's an economy of data sharing with all industries eventually involved. It's very thoughtful and it places the customer and the customer's wants at the centre of data sharing. So no data sharing takes place without a customer directing it. And another key part of it is implied consent. So direct consent. So customers must understand why they're sharing data and they must give third-party consent just for that direct use case. So your data is not getting shared out to a third party who will then use it for nefarious purposes. It's only getting used for for the things that you've consented for. Say, for example, to do a mortgage comparison to get you a better offer on your mortgage. So Scott Farrell from Kingwood Mallison obviously took the PC report and then looked at that in the banking lens. We thought his report was excellent. It set up some excellent sort of ideas around thinking on data, to think data is the same as money, so it should be treated the same with the care, with security around it, the same way that money's exchanged. We also think he had a very good principle of reciprocity, which I'll come to in a minute. How we're working with the 3 agencies, so Treasury's doing the enabling legislation, which we've commented, we had 2 opportunities to comment on that legislation, which was great that they gave industry 2 opportunities to comment. We're broadly comfortable with where that's ended up. There's a few things around privacy which we think are quite confusing in practice and might lead to some confusion around the customer's rights, understanding what their rights are under sort of 2 privacy regimes, but generally speaking, we're broadly comfortable with where the Treasury landed. We're working with the IIC on the rules framework now, which is, as Bruce said, we're all suitably uncomfortable. But I think the thing that's very clear is that everybody who's working on this is really committed to a successful regime and trying to get there by July next year. There's a lot of goodwill, but there's also a lot of stretched resources across all the organisations involved, I would say. As the banking industry obviously has another bit of piece of work that's going on at the same time, but we're looking at this, and we're working with everyone involved to try and get there by July and have a safe but useful system that actually has meaningful outcomes. The thing that's sort of taking up most time is the technical work with the enterprise architects from the banks and the technical people at Data 61 working on how you design security systems and how you have a taxonomy for data sharing. You know, we don't have a commonly agreed definition of what a mortgage is in Australia. It's just evolved. So having a taxonomy that recognises that there's differences between each institution, but captures enough that you can meaningfully compare data, it's really difficult. But you also don't want to over-specify things that you don't allow competition and innovation to happen. So striking that balance with technical people in the room, policy people and compliance people, I think it's fair to say that nobody knows exactly what's going on. We're all sort of piecing it together, all together, sort of walking through a fog together, I think. So then that's where we're at the moment. The two sort of big longer term issues that we have around the CDR, I think they're interrelated, so I'll mention them together, are reciprocity and value-added data. There's two things that came up in the PC data report, and they also came up in Farrell report, and we think they're fundamental for customers to get the most benefit from their data. So reciprocity is essentially, it's saying that a customer, so the CDR regime will start in July next year, so 4 banks will be there on day one because they're mandated to be there. But there could be, as Bruce said, some smaller banks who decide for competitive reasons to join earlier. So we say if you join earlier, you'll be able to access the data from the 4 major banks as direct if the customers of those 4 major banks direct the data to you. But equally, because now you've joined the data economy, you should be required to share data back into the system if your customers direct that you share that data. So there's a cost to entry, and that is that your data becomes available as well. But that means that all the participants who are sharing data all have access to the same raw data. There's not an asymmetry where only the data from the major banks is going in. Anybody who's in the CDR is sharing data. So that's fine because our banks all agree that that's a good idea. And it's fine because they've all got similar sort of data. They've got transaction data or mortgage data. I think it's important to note that Scott Farrell actually said that if you come from outside of an industry, so if you join the CDR July next year because you want to receive banking data, but you're from a different industry, then you should be required to share your data, which is deemed to be equivalent data, back into the system. So why does this matter? I think if we want to sort of euphemistically refer to who we're thinking about when we think about this, I think we call them large, well-resourced, multinational technology companies with advanced analytical abilities. So I think what we're saying is that, for example, if Alibaba wants to join next year, they also have data. They have wallet data, Alipay data. They also have other data on customers. Google's the same. We don't believe that they should access the data, banking data, and be able to sort of ingest that into their system, which they can couple with their search engine or all the sort of rich data set that they have, come up with a product, a financial sector services product that they've been able to develop because they also have a monopoly on a set of data. So we're saying once you're sharing data, you should be having to offer up data. And in their case, they have Google Wallet data or Alipay data or Apple Wallet data. So they do already have equivalent data that should be their entry cost. We just think that's how customers are going to get the best value. That's how we're going to have a situation where people are competing on their analytical abilities, not on their data holds. And so that leads to value-added data. So we've consistently said that raw data should be the only thing that falls within the CDR that's been accepted. Broadly speaking, there's sort of a spectrum of what value-added data is. But the intention was it's raw data. So it's your transaction. So how much you spend, where, when. So when I say value-added data, I'm talking about a credit score. So a model that the bank has used, pieced together a position of you to work out your ability to repay. That's their credit model, that's their IP. They've come up with that. I'm not talking about what we call derived data, which is an account balance, where they've just taken a bunch of transactions, which is raw data, added them together, and that's come up with an account balance. That's not value-added data. That's a derived data. So we're saying keep value-added data out of the system, and the reason why it goes back to if you've got reciprocity, then everyone has the same set of raw data. They all can simply be competing in a fair way by feeding in this data into their analytical abilities. Their algorithms are what's driving competition and innovation. It's not the data that they hold. So value-added data, you don't need to share value-added data if everybody's required to share the same data or their equivalent data. So that's my 2 points, and I'm sorry if I've hectored you, Bruce, because I've talked to Bruce about this. But I think they're the 2 things that that concern us. I will make the point on reciprocity, how the ACCC can deem the difficulty on reciprocity is not in the thinking or the concept, it's how you actually put it in practice. So if you have a social media company joining the CDR, how do you go about the steps to assess what data they have, come up with a set of APIs for them, taxonomy for them? So we understand that's the complexity, and that's why it's not likely to happen in July next year, but we think it's a very key principle that needs to be part of the CDR, and that those players need to know that at some point they will need to share the data. So that's
Lucky last with an eye on the clock. I'm Luke van Hooft from Optus. We're kind of in a unique position here in that we're looking at this regime that's currently focused on banking. No one's going to hit us. And that's kind of the lens that we've taken so far. We've obviously contributed some submissions to some issues and try to stay at a high level as best we can. I have 3 points I want to make. First one is that the CDR rules are supposed to be economy-wide and not just banking. The second one is that we certainly feel that consideration of existing processes, industry processes before designation would be much beneficial. And last and potentially a little bit controversial is that this is supposed to be a consumer right, not a data recipient right. So I'll cover those 3 things quite briefly. I think we're getting increasingly worried that the development of this right at the moment is focused too much on banking. Rightly so, it has to be done by July, but the focus on banking seems to be coming through the legislation, which is quite dangerous. So the first draft of Treasury's legislation would have decimated the data industry in this country. It would not, the industry is developing now. It would not be there. It would have stopped it very quickly. And that's got to do with the value-added data. The second draft is a slight improvement, but it still worries us that value-added data is in the legislation. Or derived data, depending on how you define it, but the concept that any kind of intellectual property or effort done on data transformation can be shared is worrying. What's also worrying is there seems to be less emphasis on the Productivity Commission's report and more emphasis on open banking when making the legislation. And there are some key things where they seem to differ in our reading of it, and obviously value-added data is definitely one of them, and the PC was very clear that value-added data should not be included because for the exact reasons it would destroy innovation and competition. There's another part there which the 2 seem to differ, and that's the inclusion of large business. So the PC recommended only consumers and small businesses less than $3 million should be included in the regime. We certainly support that. We have no idea why a large business which is excluded from the privacy regime, which is not subject to Australian consumer law, seems to be included into this consumer right. I mean, why large banks, standard banking, why CBA needs Optus' help to tell them how they consume IT really doesn't make sense to us. It's going to impose significant costs on the telco industry to include big business, and we don't really see any offsetting advantage. And of course, given the fact that the PEC recommended against it. So there's some improvements in the legislation that we'd definitely like to see before it's passed. I think on value-added data, I think it's important to notice that we have, I think, a much different view of what value-added data is than what's discussed in banking. So, banking's talking about credit scores. I don't care about credit scores. That's not value-added data. Value-added data is what we can tell city planners about where people are coming from and the length of travel and what happens when a rail line fails. We can tell City Rail where people move, what the congestion is, where they move to, what their reaction is. We can significantly increase the ability, for example, of smart cities and city planning. That for us is value-added data. If that stuff's included in the CDR, there's going to be significant detriment, and there is a risk at the current draft and that will be included, and that's kind of what our worry is. On the second point about explicit consideration of existing arrangements, the telco industry is built around interconnection. We have a very strong industry body. We are designed to communicate between networks. We share data all the time. We have portability regimes. We have data retention regimes. We have disclosure regimes. We have plan information regimes. We have so many rules about data and how to tell customers. It'd be very important that any new CDR is consistent with all the existing rules, actually looks at whether or not any additional consumer data right is needed on top of existing practices, and also where exactly that data is going to come from. So this thing here is the greatest collector of data ever. It's not us, it's the phone. The consumer has in their pocket everything they need to know about how they consume things on their phone. There are hundreds of apps that they can download straight now that will tell them their usage, their historic usage, and they can easily be used to tell them what best plan they need to be on. The more kind of we think about what this regime is going to look like in telcos, the less I see that there is a significant benefit that can be derived. That coupled with the fact that we have simple products. So in fixed line, all you need to know is, do you want to pay $6 for an unlimited plan, or $65 for an unlimited plan, or $7 for an unlimited plan? Fixed line's even simple, all the same network. You don't even have a choice of network there. Mobile's going down the same route. All the plans have unlimited voice, unlimited SMS, and you just choose whether for $40 you want 20 gigs, $6 you want 80 gigs, or however much data you want. So it's really just a consideration of the consumer, how much data they consume, which again, simple apps exist now and phones measure it themselves. So the last point, which leads nicely on the last point, which is this is a consumer right, not a data recipient right. We can quite easily pass this data on to the consumer if they don't already have it. Give it to the consumer, say, you do what you want with it. You want to share it to someone, share it to someone. That's fine. This is just an Excel spreadsheet. Go off, do what you need to do. Why there needs to be a multi-million-dollar regime that has significant privacy implications that we've got to build whole new systems for to send data to people we've probably never heard of before or outside the country or different industries, when in fact all we need to do is either tell the consumer to use this app or pass the existing billing data that we have onto an electronic form. So in the telco sphere, this should be quite simple and costless to implement, and I really hope that is not lost through the implementation in the banking and the energy sectors.